It's a pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Sher-Gil Sundaram Arts Foundation, SSAF. My name is Latika Gupta, and I work at the foundation as Director Projects. I think all of you must already know this, but SSAF was founded by Vivan Sundaram and his sister Navina Sundaram. And since its inception in 2016, the foundation's mandate has been to support and enable conjunctions of artistic and cultural practice through a series of grants supporting the arts, research, and writing, as well as via a range of programs, lectures, and symposia. At the foundation, we are committed to advancing creative independence that's based on secular principles and also freedom of expression, and to supporting alternative and heterodox practices. And I encourage all of you to visit our website, ssaf.in, to learn more about our grants, programs, and publications. Kasauli Art Centre, 1976 to 1991, has been published by SSAF Tulika Books, a co-publishing initiative between the Sher-Gil Sundaram Arts Foundation and Tulika Books. We publish a range of books on artists, the arts and cultural studies, including art historical, critical, and theoretical writing. Several of these books are available outside, just outside the hall, so if you haven't already taken a look, please do so after the program. The book being launched and discussed today focuses on the Kasauli Art Centre, which was established by Vivan Sundaram at Ivy Lodge, his family home in the Kasauli Hills in 1976. Ivy Lodge was bequeathed to Vivan and his sister Navina by their mother, Indira Sher-Gil Sundaram. And from 1976 up until 1991, the center regularly organized artist workshops, seminars, theater, performances, film screenings, and other arts-related events with both Indian and international artists in residence in workshops that were perhaps amongst the first of their type in the country. This book is particularly special. The Kasauli Art Centre forms part of the legacy and the future activities of SSAF. It also marks our move into what Vivan envisioned and was working on as SCAP, the SSAF Kasauli Art Project, which will be a part of our activities very soon. At the heart of all of this, of course, is Vivan Sundaram, who was closely involved in the making of this book. And we dedicate this book and the evening to Vivan, friend, colleague, and guide. To begin, I'd like to invite Indu Chandrasekhar, publisher and managing editor of SSAF Tulika Books, to present the first copies of the book to artists Arpita Singh and Ghulam Mohammad Sheikh, both of whom were closely involved with the Kasauli Art Centre over several years. Thank you, Arpita ji and Sheikh Bhai. Our first panel is with Belinder Dhanoa, and author, and Sharna Dastur, designer of the book, along with Indu Chandrasekhar. So Belinder and Sharna, if I could invite you up, please.
Thank you, Latika. and good evening, everybody. I am delighted on behalf of the Sher-Gil Sundaram Arts Foundation and Tulika Books, and most of all, of course, on behalf of someone who is not among us today, yet is hugely present in so many ways, the inspiration and moving force behind the book we have just formally launched, Vivan Sundaram, to initiate a conversation on the making of the book with its author Belinder, Dhanoa, and designer Sher-Gil. It is an added pleasure to be in the midst of so many individuals this evening who were integral to the activities of the Kasauli Art Centre, which is the subject of this book. Many of you have seen the book already, so I won't attempt a description of its contents. Instead, I would like to move straight into a discussion with Belinder and Sher-Gil about the making of the book. But a few words first to evoke the central role Vivan played in this process, as well as a brief recall of my long association with him as a publisher and friend, working on several other book projects. My association with Vivan in this regard goes back actually to the Journal of Arts and Ideas, where I was inducted as a member of the editorial collective in the early 1980s. There are members of that collective present here too, Geeta and Ashish, among others. I was primarily involved in the production of the journal and soon discovered that Vivan too had a particular interest in aspects of print production such as format, page layout, design, paper, binding, etc. Both high and low art in the art of bookmaking. This was a shared interest that carried through in the making of several books we did together, Vivan and I, including, of course, his magnum opus, the 2-volume set on Amrita Sher-Gil, and the books on his own Calcutta Victoria Memorial installation and his photographic works. Copies of all these books are available outside and on display. Vivan would literally roll up his sleeves and see a book through from start to finish, from its editorial structuring through to working closely and very sustainedly with the designer, right up to supervising the actual printing of the book on the machine floor of the press. And this involvement carried through in this latest book project on the Kasauli Art Centre, despite his ill health that hampered its smooth progress. To quote from the dedication page we inserted at the end of the book just before it went to press, soon after Vivan's passing, this book was a project dear to Vivan Sundaram's heart, and he worked on it closely over several years. Involved in every detail of the book, he finished the collaborative project just a day before he went into hospital early this year. He did not live to see it in its printed form, but the book is testimony to his passion, both for the Kasauli Art Centre and for the process of bookmaking. With these words, I turn to Belinder, the author of the book, to discuss the process of her writing, how she worked with what might have felt like unwieldy material in several registers and voices besides her own, and including long interview-based conversations with key persons associated with the Kasauli Art Centre, and how she structured all of this, occasionally using devices from fiction writing and other devices, into a wonderfully evocative and reflective textual narrative that goes back and forth, displacing chronological linearity. Belinder, over to you.
Wonderful to see all of you here and to be able to talk about this book and the making of the book. I would like to ask you, however, would you prefer that I spend my minutes reading something from the book or speaking about the process? Read something? Oh, okay. Okay, I'll do a little bit.
I think both.
Okay. So just as an introduction, I would like to say that when Vivan and Geeta asked me to do this project, I wasn't quite sure what their expectations were. But after about maybe a week or so of thinking about it, I did know what I wanted to do if I were to take on this project. There were several concerns that I had, which I knew I would have to deal with. I knew, for example, that this was not going to be any kind of a definitive history of the Kasauli Art Centre. I also knew that there was so little written documentation of the time that I would be very reliant on memory recall, speaking with people who had been there and who would have to remember time which was, a few decades past. This, of course, was an issue because I had to be very alert to the kind of narrativizing and the instability of memory, and also be conscious of the fact that where I was asking these questions and, who was asking them for what reason would definitely affect what was going to be told to me in terms of the what was going to be told to me. So, besides all of this, I also knew, for example, that the many people who came to the Kasauli Art Centre over these many years brought with them, from different disciplines, different backgrounds, different areas of work, brought with them everything that they had which made Kasauli what it was, which made the KAC what it was. So this meant that I would have to contextualize the Kasauli Art Centre within a much larger and broader cultural frame. That was exciting actually for me, because I got to learn a lot from the people and from the reading that I was doing. What I was absolutely sure of before I wrote a word was also that this was going to be a book which was polyphonic. The many, many voices that were informing me had to be presented without my direction, my paraphrasing, or my interpretation. They had to speak. I'm not quite sure what the word is, but they had to speak for themselves without my direction. So, given these concerns, I did have to think about how I was going to address them. And one of the solutions, perhaps, that I found was to make the process of the research and the writing completely visible within the book to the reader. In attempting to do that, one of the devices I used were the writing of these fragments, which are inserted or which you find in the text as notes to myself. And in these notes, I allowed for my subjectivity to appear directly, to be able to show my perspective and my point of view. How was I listening? How was I learning? How was I collecting this information and knowledge and interpreting it in a sense? So my questions and concerns appear in these sections called Notes to Myself. The entire text is written in short sections, in longer chapters, in a certain kind of fragmentation as well. And I have used, given the diverse material and the different disciplines from which all this information was coming to Kasauli, I have reached out to various genres and forms of writing, including academic writing, including the memoir, including fiction and narrative nonfiction, and putting it together in, as Indu has said, these different registers which were required because the material was coming from so many different sources and had different ways of adding to what was happening at the Kasauli Art Centre. So with this kind of hybridization of form, I found that I needed as well to structure it in a particular way, and I found that the structure and form that I was working with or building up, in a sense, had its own narrative, had its own politics. It was a way for me to challenge, well, to a certain degree, to challenge very strict disciplinary boundaries and also to challenge ideas of purity. It also was able to reflect a certain interdisciplinarity, which I found was a reflection of what was happening in the Kasauli Art Centre, the interdisciplinarity. So the structure and form of the book as well speaks to or reflects some of what was happening in the Kasauli Art Centre. I thought this was important because I do feel that whether it's moments, events, forms of writing bleed into each other. And they inform, they infect, they morph into something which I always hope will be something beautiful. And I think that was happening at the Kasauli Art Centre. So working in this manner, I had to also rationalize for myself why I was doing it in this way, because there is no one uniform structure. It allows for fragmentation. It allows for silences between the fragmentation. The continuity in the text lies within the fragments, within the chapters, and not always in the silences between. So I had to think myself of why I was doing this. And, well, perhaps it isn't the best explanation or rationalization in the world, but what I was thinking about is that the world is not an unchangeable entity. That reality in itself is something which is dispersed, which is fragmented, and that it's not the task of the writer to reflect, what did I say, a kind of a whole or a completely embodied reality. That to allow that for that fragmentation of even our experiences to show. And I think that is the task of the writer, is to not show that, but to show how each of these moments, each of these events is historically produced, rather than just reflecting or representing what we might think of as one or a reality. And for me, it was it was the form and the structure of the book which had to reflect this, because I was also wanting to reflect what was happening at the Kasauli Art Centre, which had its fragmentation, which had those moments of the silences, which didn't always, there wasn't always a conversation between, say, one year to the next, one event to the next, etc. So I wanted the form and structure to reflect that as well. I think I'm kind of getting tired of my own voice. But yeah, so I was very clear that I wanted my project to be a reflection on something rather than a representation or a reflection of something. I wanted the reader to be able to see how I came to know something, rather than to very authoritatively or categorically say, this is what I know. And of course, as a writer, I also think it's a writer's ploy, in a sense, to draw the reader in, to make the reader engage with the material, because there is the space within the text for the reader to engage with the material. So, well, that's it. That's my process, as briefly as I can put it. I could ramble on all evening and get you know. But I think that to honor Vivan, I would like to read a little bit from this chapter, which is a kind of, it's a chapter which has a linear narrative. It's a chapter which is descriptive, but which I think was important for me to write, because I had to find a way to see what made it possible for Vivan to build a certain kind of thought and generosity to make the Kasauli Art Centre. So I'm going to read a little bit from this chapter. It's called, does anyone here speak French?
You won't be
Yeah. So, because, well, pretend you can't hear the accent. the chapter is Vivan, it's a question, Vivan, a Swasant Vita, which is Vivan, a 68er. And I start the chapter with you know, a kind of a roll call, a listing of the various events that happened, you know, in various parts of the world. During 68, it was an incredibly tumultuous, a time full of energy. You know, you had the student protests, the protests against the Vietnam War, and this was a time when Vivan was a postgraduate student in London. So this is, I'm going to read a section from that. Okay. I'm not going to tell you when it is Vivan's voice speaking and when it is mine, and use quotation marks and all of that, so you'll hear it. That moment of 68 is important to me. I remember it as a moment when so many things were happening out from beyond the cubicle studio I had at the Slade School. In a sense, that's what I came from in Baroda, a very rich art context, but one that did not refer to the larger world of politics. The 60s was an exciting time in the world, and 1968 happened when I was doing the final year of my post-graduation in painting in London. I was thrown into this very dynamic, exciting world of anarchists and situationists, Mick Jagger and music concerts in Hyde Park, and that tremendous quality of youth culture had permeated the air. The Slade School was part of the University College London, and among Sundaram's friends there were students of theatre, philosophy, sociology, and art. Althea Jones, a very political West Indian student of chemistry, became a good friend, and the two happened to meet Hilary Rawlings, who inherited a ramshackle house north of King's Cross. They worked with her to bring the house to some order and turned it into a commune. The Living Theatre and members of the Bread and Puppet Theatre made contact with Rawlings, and the house soon became a confluence of people moving in and out, using the space for various activities. When Sunil Kathari visited London, he turned up at this radical commune and had Yamini Krishnamurthy present a lecture demonstration, much to the probing curiosity of the local skinheads. Art seemed to have a lot to do with connecting people from various disciplines. It was an open house that suggested a sense of togetherness and community, and the kind of social action that was prevalent then. It was dominated by what might be called an anarchist position that reflected the student movement of the 60s. The Communist Party was considerably more orthodox, and Tariq Ali was considered to be a Trotskyite or a new left person. That was the political register at that time. Somehow this commune seemed to attract the anarcho-situationists, a somewhat fluid cross-section. Christine Faure, a French anarchist who was studying Artaud, came to the commune through a contact and was very critical of my interest in India's Naxalbari movement. She said, "Don't you know that the anarchists and communists have a long history of hating each other?" But the overall political reference and focus were very much of spontaneous political action. We formed a group that was part of the squatters. You know that Centre Point building at the end of Oxford Street? I spent many a night there. We stuck anti-apartheid posters on the South African Airlines building. Soon after June 68, I built this little silkscreen workshop in the house together with a Tunisian sculptor who had been expelled from Paris and whom I met on the steps of the Slade and invited to stay with us. When he completed his post-diploma in painting, Sundaram began to attend lectures in the history of cinema until his scholarship ended and he dropped out. He was living in the commune at that time and attended political meetings of one kind or the other all across London. And it goes on. Do I have more time?
If you want to read some more, otherwise we can go to Sharon and
Yeah,
maybe you can read
yeah.
a little more.
I think so, because I know we have a very tight...
We have it. We have a tight evening session, but we have time for another small review after Sherna. Now, Sherna, if you could tell us about how you approach the design of the book, putting image and text together, not in an illustrative mode, which you would reject immediately, but to curate and create a parallel visual narrative, as it were. Most of all, of course, we would like to hear about you from you about the process of working with Vivan, who was so involved in the design of this book, his close attention to and memory for visual detail. Sherna.
Am I audible? Okay. Vivan had, I think, shot 90% of what is in the book. So he'd taken most of these photographs that are in the book. I don't know whether we've really written that anywhere. You know, I always feel a bit sad that we've not made that clear. We have? That's good. That's good. Okay. So, and I don't think that his impulse to photograph the Kasauli workshops and events and people and children and fun and tomfoolery of all kinds, I don't think that his impulse was to document in that sense. I think his impulse, for me at least, his impulse felt more like a way to retain, you know, fond memories of a coming together, which is what Kasauli really was, you know, a huge coming together. So, so I think he approached it, you know, the photographing itself at that time, he approached it with this, you know, flamboyance, which is what he was, you know, I mean, he just shot what he liked, and more to retain memories rather than to document in any way. And when we started working on the book, he came to it with so much enthusiasm and energy, and that I'm sure he did with, you know, any work that he ever did. But this one was a little special because he was reliving all those years by, you know, looking at these photographs again, you know, going through what, you know, telling us crazy stories about what was happening at that time. And so in a way that, you know, he was reliving them. So for me, designing an archive is a bit, you know, it's an awful job for a designer. I mean, it's really the worst thing you can ask someone to do, to put tiny images, you know, over so many pages. You know, I mean, it's like you're starting out with a disability. But what was most exciting for me was that it was not, the main character in this book was not perhaps the Kasauli Art Centre, but it was Vivan, or more accurately, Vivan's memory. So it was Vivan who shot these images, and and then later, so many years later, it's Vivan whose memories of events informed so much of what is on the page. So another thing that helped was the way Belinder wrote, you know, this seamlessly going, you know, over so many registers, slipping in and out of so many different things, also gave that kind of freedom, you know, to one to actually do what, you know, make it fanciful and make it the way you want. So we had several meetings, Indu, Vivan and I, and Vivan would, you know, each meeting would bring up a whole plethora of new stories that he would tell us, because we were looking at a particular year or a particular period, and then he'd tell us these, you know, some hilarious stories about what was happening at that time, and, you know, this photograph, and it was so nice to see these together, or something. And I found myself after a few meetings, you know, writing furiously. Often they were on Zoom. We had very few in-person meetings, about 3 or 4. And most of them were on Zoom. And when we were on Zoom, I would just write what he's saying, you know, and then spend weeks scrolling through that enormous archive to try and bring some sense of those moments that he's talking about, to bring some kind of feeling of what it might have been to be there in Kasauli.
So rather than it being a structured sort of a telling of how things were and the documentation of the workshops, this became again a series of fragments, a series of gestures, a few trying very hard to find some form of inner coherence between totally different images to have a sense of a story unfolding through the pages. It's really heartbreaking that Vivan isn't here because there were so many of these pages that he found them so interesting because he'd tell some really crazy joke, and then he wanted to he would find he would be very tickled by how some images are sitting next to others on a page. And it really, for me, it's heartbreaking that he's not here to share these pages with you and his excitement with some juxtapositions that we had done. And well, I'm a bad teller, for better. So that's all, really.
Thank you, Sherna. And just an interesting sidelight before I think we have time for another short reading by Belinder. An interesting sidelight is that Belinder, Sherna and I, the three people on the stage here, who made this book with Vivan, are the only three among the speakers this evening, besides several of you in the audience, of course, who were not direct participants in the activities at Kasauli Art Centre. None of us attended any of the workshops or performances or events at Kasauli. And yet, through the making of this book, we have come to feel a sense of belonging, a familiarity with that institution that I think will stay with us for a long time. Yes, Belinder.
Okay, I'll read from again a brief section from one of the other chapters. Yeah. This chapter is titled, "What Can Art Do?" Again, a question. The first Kasauli Art Workshop was in 1976, a year after the emergency was declared, Vivan Sundaram tells me. I make a note of the marker he has used to remember that time. What significance do these markers have in the way we order our narratives? The Kasauli workshop was imagined as distinct from the art camps that had already taken place in Kashmir, organized by G.R. Santosh under the aegis of the Lalit Kala Academy. The art camps at Kasauli were seen as being non-institutional, open to artist friends who had shared values in art, starting from Baroda and moving on to Delhi. Ramachandran was there, fresh from his painted responses to the emergency and fascism. Among the others were Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, Nalini Melani, Bhupen Thakkar, Arpita Singh, and Paramjit Singh. Some of them had participated together in a group show at the Rabindra Bhavan Galleries in Delhi in 1974. Vivan recalls Taib Mehta remarking that he saw in the show a visible change in Indian art, one that was distinct from his own kind of modernist proposition, one in which the figure was not being treated in an existential abstract manner, but was framed within a context that spoke directly to its purpose, in which there was specificity of the local and political content. What informed this change? The workshops at Kasauli Art Centre, was my initiative, Vivan says. We had no manifesto or clear intention beyond bringing a group of artists to live and work together over a period of a few weeks. The camps had a sense of celebration, of informality, and some of the artists brought along their children. Days were set aside for work and evenings ostensibly for discussions bolstered with alcohol and high spirits. Conversations, boisterous, riotous, drunken, indiscreet. It was a safe place, someone said. You could let your hair down, and what fell out of it remained in Kasauli. In my conversations with Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, he points to the Kasauli camps as different from other artists' camps. Importantly, they were an artist's initiative. In a good sense, this was a collective, all of us living and working together. We shared ideas and showed our work to each other. The camps in Kasauli gradually evolved from a focus on the visual arts to other disciplines, including the discursive, a logical and rational approach to having an annual event. There were not just art practitioners present, but also thinkers and historians, a variety of people, all in the same camp. The nature of camp changed. Due credit should be given to those responsible for bringing the artists together, for visualizing it as the world of art connecting with the larger cultural scene and then becoming international. Wherever we were in a position to connect, we opened doors to places that were open to such ideas, creating new mixes and responding to each other in fruitful exchange. With the help of the Max Muller Bhavan and the British Council, we invited artists from Germany and Britain, Ken Kiff, John Davies. Parenthesis. Dhruv Mistry, I think, benefited from that interaction. They were all accessible, available for dialogue. It was a kind of collective that could work here and could perhaps have worked in socialist countries, but not in the Western European context with its developed market system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharna. Thank you, Belinder. Now over to the next panel. I'll take it.
Thank you, Indu, Belinder, and Sharna. One of the things that wasn't mentioned was that the last 1/3 of the book is actually dedicated to a very, very comprehensive and extensive timeline of the Kasauli Art Centre, which documents literally every single person who was there, whether as an invited artist or there was this strange category of was present. So there were a huge number of artists, theatre people, musicians who were just present. All of them are listed. And the timeline forms almost the sort of format of a scrapbook, which Vivan was also very, very fond of making. But over to our next panel, which is chaired by critic and curator Geeta Kapoor, who will be in conversation with artist pedagogue Ghulam Mohammad Sheikh and film theorist and curator Ashish Rajadaksh. So may I invite you to the dais, please.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see a full hall. We were very anxious that today's traffic advisory would lose us the audience, but it's very, very nice to have everyone together and many who were part of the experience of Kasauli Art Centre. We've had two descriptions from, well, primarily one description from Belinder that gives, through her non-participant position, a view of the atmosphere, the ideology, the consequence of the Kasauli Art Centre. I want to begin with Belinder herself and her written script. The exuberance of gatherings, workshop energy, and nebulous community, and proposed collectives emerging from counterpositions within what may be called camping anarchy. The word anarchy comes often in Vivan's articulation, but I think that even loosely used, not correctly politically used, even loosely used, it's a word that comes into life at the Kasauli Art Centre. This lived experience translates into Belinder's writing. The text loops and contradicts and reconnects at various points through using her own and many other voices, seemingly synchronous, but with a deliberate ruse. The form admits dissonance, and the narrative develops a points of view that are a little askance. And I give a little example here of how she plays with voices. There's a point at which she interviews Anita Dubé and quotes her for a bit. And then she moves on to what we don't know is Anita speaking or Belinder speaking. And then again in the next paragraph, she moves on to mocking me very forthrightly and using quite insulting words about me. And I thought, has Anita said this? Is Belinder calling me all this? And then I looked at the words and they were mine. So, and I was, they were very pointedly mocking words. And obviously I had performed that self-mockery quite genuinely. And Belinder just made the whole thing move from herself, Anita, to herself and to me. And whoever is reading it will probably think somebody was abusing me. And so these tricks happen through the text. Belinder writes and teaches fiction. This is real life fiction. Kasauli Art Centre has been and become something of a fiction in the memory of a generation of artists, including theatre and film practitioners, critics and scholars, who passed through the doors of Ivy Lodge and paused long enough to reflect on living in the present and practicing friendship and dialogue as an act of faith. Further, the long-form essay that Belinder evolves contextualizes how that present had taken on art history and contemporary politics. She contextualizes without pedagogic intent. That is, she foregrounds her subjective and recursive turns within the contextual rendering of art and life from the 60s through the 80s in India. Along with Belinder's writerly style and her textual form, there are major editorial interventions in the book. Vivan, initiator of the Romance of an Artist Community and Kasauli Art Centre, was an obsessive archivist involving the Sher-Gil family and, in this instance, his mother, remembering her solitary end in Kasauli, her last home. But he was an archivist activist. He made a project of hospitality, an overused word today, and he filled the bereft home with a revolving theatre of diverse players. This is what he wanted to capture in this book, and he did so in conjunction with Indira Chandrasekhar, the editor and publisher of the book, and Sherna, the designer obsessed with the image-text relation on the page, somewhere dense, somewhere sparse, making up an image choreography cued to memory. The book has text inserts by participants from the discursive projects in Kasauli. Those intense symposia in the hills, as I've written, those intense symposia in the hills, as I have called them. There are film scripts of Vivan Sundaram's German television films on Kasauli workshops. There is an exhaustive timeline compiled by Vivan where every single participant, from babies to staff, besides artists, are sought to be named and pictured. And there is an end piece on the project SCAP. That is, as always with Vivan's life and work, but another beginning. And Latika, right in the beginning, spoke of SCAP. So I'll not elaborate. It's Sher-Gil Sundaram Kasauli Art Project, a new space, which began with the project, a project he called Fall of the Slab, which was the slab upon which numerous theatre and performative events took place. That slab had to be demolished for municipality reasons, and he made that into a project whereby it could then revive into another life, which we hope SSAF will now take on and continue. I'll ask my colleagues here some questions which I have written down. They are not in any way obliged to stick to the question and answer them, but it gives me a chance to speak about certain aspects of Kasauli Art Centre, to which the two protagonists here will have much to say and much more besides that to say. Ghulam, you attended 4 workshops in Kasauli. In 1979, the artist group included your senior colleague K.G. Subramaniam and a much admired sculptor from Britain, John Davis. It was convivial, artists with family and children, handcrafting informal work. In 1982, you came briefly to a workshop where the Journal of Arts and Ideas was conceived and dazzled everyone with your signal talk, Viewer's View, spanning an art historical range from Velasquez's Las Meninas to Bishan Das's House of Sheikh and Sheikh Pool and Vinod Bihari Mukherjee's mural at Hindi Bhavan, Shantiniketan. In 1983, you were invited to a film symposium conceived by a very young Ashish Rajadhaksh with Kumar Shani and Ketan Mehta. Here was a maverick intersection of practitioners and scholars, and perhaps also the beginning of film studies debates as presented in a Journal of Arts and Ideas issue based on this symposium. The third time was in 1988 when Ashish and I conceived a fully discursive platform titled Critique of Contemporary Culture. Its ambition still startles us because, after all, this was no institute of research, but an artist space with an informal mock-up for a seminar table. This resulted in 2 issues of Journal of Arts and Ideas. My question is to Ghulam, such gatherings where artists interacted with theorists, for example, Suzy Tharu and Kumkum Sangari as feminists, historian of the national movement, Professor Ravindra Kumar, and Marxist political scientist Sudipto Kaviraj. What did this encounter staged on the ground of an artist space, churn up in us? What substantial difference did it make in our own creative, discursive space in the sphere of art? Perhaps, Ghulam, you'll take some of it and then move on to your own.
So in the popular parlance, you would say, what are the takeaways? For me, there are 2 major gains that I made, and I would put it this way. One was painting and simultaneously writing. I had a model before me, my own mentor, K.G. Subramanian, who was both a painter and a writer. I know it was frowned upon earlier by many a painter, saying that writing is not your business. You should stick to what the business of painting is. But that is one thing that came to Kasauli in a manner, in a slightly different, that I used to write in my mother tongue, Gujarati. I wrote on art. I also read poetry, but that's a different matter. But I wrote on art, number of essays. But I had begun to write in English. And that began around 1969 when Bhupen Kakkar and I began editing a journal called Vrishchik. It was also a lesson in learning English. So we were doing that. But writing in English was a huge challenge because I was not grown up with English. I grew up with Gujarati and at the most Hindi. English was a learnt language. So I had to find a way to deal with it. How to? But I managed. And I wrote an article. And I think before it was published in Journal of Arts and Ideas, as you mentioned, I wrote a piece called Viewer's View. It is looking at 3 works of art. I was a teacher for a long period of time and I used to talk about art. So first was Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez, that is an easel painting. The second was a painting called House of Sheikh Pool, a Sufi, by an artist called Bishan Das, a Mughal painter of the Jahangir period. The third was a mural by Binod Bihari Mukherjee in Hindi Bhavan in Shantiniketan. All three different periods. And I attempted to do that. And I tested the waters. It was in Kasauli, and I found that I had many people, who would respond. So that was the first lesson that I learned from Kasauli. The second was, and this was an ongoing dialogue that we had with Gita and with Vivan about the role of politics in art. And we all were actually brought up on a kind of our education did not include politics. Whatever there was in Baroda, there was its own politics. That means Subramanian was Gandhian, etc., but nobody spoke about politics. It was the first time that with Vivan, we started actually arguing about politics. And so the Journal of Arts and Ideas was the later forum, but before that, in the place before the exhibition called Place for People took place, we had intensive debate. And Kasauli, in a way, consolidated it, that art cannot remain oblivious of politics. And that is something which was a major gain, I would say that. When I think of Kasauli Art Centre, or I just think of Kasauli, the place, and whatever happened there the 4 times that I've been to, and if I were to ever put it in one single word for Vivan, the artist that he was, this was also an art-making project. It was not just making symposia, it was not just bringing artists together, but being an insider and in fact initiating all kinds of, not just dialogue, all kinds of things that he did, right from, building some kind of a corner of a, and thoda repair karna ho to wo bhi saath mein karne ka ho, wo bhi ho jaye. So that means it was a totality. That man was actually making a big work of art. And in a way, Kasauli appears to me like that this is what Vivan Sundaram. So he made many an installation, we know that, but Kasauli began much earlier. Belinder is an old pal. She has worked with me. So this book is not something which comes as an unusual, it's not an unusual thing of any kind, She had worked with me on contemporary art in Baroda, and so I know her very well. But this is an exceptional book. This is not like the book that we had. This is, in a way, using the material that others have presented to her. And then it has to be processed in her own mind and put it together. So, literally 2 or 3 dozens of voices are there. And how would you connect voices? And what she managed, I would say, is to actually weave them together, almost like a weaver. She brought them together, and in a way, she found continuity among disjunctions. And disjunctions were also retained, but at the same time, if you were to read it, you would feel that you are moving from point to point. So it, in a way, also while writing about Kasauli, maps a trajectory of contemporary Indian art of the time. And I would say that it is a document of the 15 years of contemporary Indian art, that not everything, but you have a moment in the history of contemporary Indian art when certain ideas were tested by not just Vivan, but a whole lot of people together. So it was a collective thinking in a way, and that made what this book is. So that's why I call it an exceptional book. It's not common. It's not just a simple history book. It's not just sort of outlines one phase to the other, but it brings together all the disjunctions, disjunctures, and connects them and puts them in she maps a trajectory. So here you are in Baroda, here you are in Kasauli, here you are in even Braunschweig, and you have a number of voices speaking behind you. I think someday somebody should see how that book or those voices have come together, in which manner, and how do they construct a kind of a historical moment. I think every period has its own historical moment, and in some way Kasauli marks a historical moment. And I think that is one of the best things that Belinder has been able to bring out, by doing this book. Well, if I were to speak about it, I can go on speaking for half an hour or more. But I think the best thing that I would think of is that it created a space different than home. It created a space different than pedagogical center. It created a space different than a political arena. It created perhaps multiple spaces. And so everyone, each one of us had a place in it. But at the same time, we could move from one into the other. So would you move from political space into the pedagogical space? And could you move from that to quote unquote artistic space, the artists, what they were making. There were artists who were also painting. Bhupen Khakhar painted there. I also did some painting. Now that was a kind of an experiment which no other art camp in the country had attempted. And this is what Kasauli did. So you could, in your own way, it left this open to you. So if you were to move from one into the other, so if you were to be interested in, let us say, dialogue, and here is, a thinker, political thinker who is speaking about, do artists sit and listen to such things? Normally we don't. But in this space, we had all three. We had pedagogy, we had politics, and we had the art discourse. So all three were available and in a way put together in a manner where each one was initiated into the other. I had some interest in politics, but I developed much greater interest after being there. I'm sure that many friends of mine also must have felt. I would not be surprised if they would come and say that, well, Kasauli taught us something. So it was not just a little place where you went to learn, you went to live there. So it was also a lesson in living together, fighting, debating, and all kinds of crazy things that you could do. It could be part of it. So it is a package as a whole. I'm speaking in a very popular parlance, but in a way it was all there. I remember singing with Ashish Rajadhyaksha a song from Om Darbadar. I don't know whether you remember that. We went on. So there were such light moments where we were completely free of all tensions. And we were all ears when somebody was speaking on certain issues. We were all very much looking at what Vivan was doing around with the buildings and whatnot. And we also knew what our other artist friends, the theatre persons, were doing. So in a way, it was a kind of an experience which was most, I would say, either unique or most unusual. So I brought back with me lots of memories with that. Thank you.
I just want to start Ashish's own experience of Kasauli with a little cue, and he can take it or leave it. The emergency had just ended. There was turbulence and radical moves in the production and reception of art among young artists from Kerala. There was the rise of aggressive right-wing politics and a new economic dispensation and an upsurge into a market economy for art and artists. This was the actual juncture at which Kasauli Art Centre started in the mid-70s and continued till the 90s. Ashish, please offer your own understanding of the Kasauli workshops you attended in 1982, 83, 88 and 1991, choosing what you prefer. Perhaps mention the adventure and folly of bringing 35mm film cans of world film classics by train and bus and showing these in the cantonment cinema hall at Kasauli, and the obsessive viewing of Kamal Swarup's Om Darbadar sitting in what Belinder calls Amrita's carpet. More pointedly, I want you to evaluate this partisan claim that these Kasauli Art Centre conclaves, including the seminar on feminism in 1989, which will be discussed in the next panel, may be seen as early experiments in what would become formal curricula of cultural studies. And further, what you think of that transformation. Inevitable, yes, but was the maverick form of a dialogue passed over too firmly into academia, not academic pedagogy, and not experiential political dialogue?
Thanks for that, Geeta. And I'm going to try and address all of that in 8 minutes if I can. But I want to really begin with something else here. Almost exactly a month ago, today, I heard Ghulam Sheikh speak on Vinod Bihari Mukherjee in Ahmedabad. It was a new presentation. And yet again, 40 years on, after we heard Viewer's View, and Viewer's View, frankly, was like a bolt of lightning at that time. It was not something that I had heard of, I had not encountered anything like it. And I encountered that same feeling a month ago, just to tell you that it lives, it continues. To be able to actually speak of Velasquez, Bishan Das, and Vinod Bihari in the same breath, as though these are people that you can have access to, people who have a condition of consciousness that you can enter into. I'm going to make a connection between such an act, on the one hand, to be able to speak of this kind of art, and the cultural studies question as we will probably encounter it. I think there's some connection there. But it may have had one interesting consequence, which is that the editorial note that came out with the film issue spoke about two filmmakers that we have spoken about in Kasauli, S. Eisenstein and K. Mehta. It is possible to talk like that, we realized. Because both their films are shown on the same screen at the same time. There is then a history that we saw. I mean, we actually encountered it, and I was very lucky at that time to have been part of that history. And our own efforts, our struggles, and to think them through has remained, as I've suggested. And there is now a book that has attempted the same struggle, and we have to now engage as much as we engage with that struggle now with this particular book. As I congratulate Belinder for this extraordinary text, I want to actually do something, Belinder, is exactly the opposite of what everyone's done. I'm going to take just one paragraph from your book. That's towards the very beginning. I'm splitting that paragraph in two halves. One is the beginning and one the end of what I'm going to say. At one time, she says, quite early on in the book, in this process of continuous flux, in the conversations, dialogue, discourse, meanings, often imperceptible to the maker, are unfolded and disclosed. In this afterlife, the work reveals our ability to alter, to create the world we want. This afterlife and the ability of this afterlife to alter and to create the world that we may want. The idea of moving back to move forward, the famous phrase of back to the future. So it says not so much back to the future, but forward into the past, as Akbar Abbas has said, is one that we believe we know well. And nevertheless, it seems as though the tricks of the trade, which is what's there in the book, the tricks of memory that it plays, is never one to which we have been entirely reconciled. We do not yet know what happens when this happens. when something that we could take for granted has been lost to us, inexorably and utterly. Something that was very proximate to us is so entirely removed from our present. What happens when that happens is something that does take us, even now it seems, into uncharted territories. This has consequences upon our present itself and our absence of collective goals. As Sudhir Patwardhan says in this book, that one of the problems that we have is that, unlike then, we do not have any collective goals anymore. We don't have any collective points of reference. We do not have mutually agreed connections. But it also has consequences where history starts playing tricks, like optical illusions, where we literally have to look back in order to look forward. For one, what is really astonishing for me, as the cover says, 1976 to 1991, we're just talking about 15 years, a scant 15 years. I mean, it's extraordinary how little, how compressed that particular time was. For another, it was in a place named Kasauli that had yet no name. Many people in the book struggle to define Kasauli, what it was at that time. Was it an art camp? Was it in India? Was it on some place on planet Earth? Did it have national challenges? Or was it, as Inga Mann says, like, mountains swooping down upon the plains like a vulture? You just give that sort of astonishing analogy that, like a vulture looking down on Corbusier's Chandigarh. For me, it defined my existence as one who stood by and took it all in, as one who recorded history, rather than one who could make it, so to say. And I've always seen myself, in hindsight, as being such a person, as being a bystander, a recorder of history, rather than someone who could actually be a person who made history. And so I'd watch Vivan do what he did. In these years, and Geeta and I defined them more precisely last night over dinner, as literally from 1980 to 1988, for me between the ages of 23 and 31, I was absorbing it like a sponge. I mean, I was completely, all my antennae were open. I was taking every word that everybody was saying, literally, as though it was something incredibly significant that was going on. It is this compressed moment of history then, at once of the past and possessing a future possibility into which we must now locate cultural studies. I mean, whatever we understand of cultural studies, inserting that into this astonishingly ambivalent moment of future and past. One in which we have sometimes claimed the 1988 conference was a key constituent presence. Geeta has talked about that conference. Cultural studies was, of course, taking off across different locations in India at that time. So many people have talked about it as being the first. And I think the book actually talks about the importance of defining certain things as the first, and why do we need to do that at all? Many people have done so, many people have made claims on cultural studies. Its primary focus across all of these, however, was an engagement with popular culture, as defined by its founder, Stuart Hall. Inside institutionalized arenas, such as universities, in Hyderabad, in Calcutta, in Bombay, in Chennai, it was framed by the need for a multidisciplinary breaking down of silos. We didn't have that particular problem because we weren't institutional. In Calcutta, the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, another place that actually also claims the origin of cultural studies for themselves, it was framed by a need for a multidisciplinary return to the efflorescence of popular cultures of the late 19th century that defined that particular strain of cultural studies, and we don't share that particular preoccupation, if you like, with the late 19th century that they had. In Hyderabad, for example, rather differently, it was framed by caste, gender, and the political histories of Telangana. We didn't share that either. Here, in Kasauli, it was framed, if at all, by this relentless emphasis on practice, or as Geeta has been theorizing, on praxis. And let me now suggest in conclusion on the astonishing shift that took place in those very years of 79 to 91, in the very nature of practice that occurred. And it became then our business to define that particular transformation, I think. That's what really defines cultural studies, our style, as again something else. And this is what I read even now when I read someone like Sheikh reading someone like Vinod Bihari. That's the connection which I want us to make. This shift was miraculous, and it was our job to define it. In 1983, just to give you an example, and Geeta talked about these film cans and so on, in 1983 we organized a film conference at Kasauli where we took 10 cans of celluloid film, approximately 10 films, that is to say approximately 12 cans per film, each can weighing approximately 3 kilos, so about 35 kilos of trunks per film, so 350 kilos of cans. And every time you took it across a state border, you were having to pay octroi and all of that stuff. And then we had to roll it down from the top all the way to the bottom and then show it in the movie theater down there. 5 years later, in 1988, I stuck in a VHS tape of Om Darbadar into my rucksack, almost as an afterthought as I was leaving for Kasauli. This was a full-on film. We then saw it on Amrita's carpet, day and night, and it was a fundamentally different experience of cinema than it had been 5 years ago. Now, those of us who do film keep mourning the loss of celluloid. But nevertheless, when you actually look at the conscious erasures that took place in this time, the kind of shifts that took in this time, and the kind of art that changed from 1979 to 91, the kind of artist Vivan was in 79 and the kind of artist Vivan became in 1991, for example, you're looking at a dramatic set of shifts that took place in multiple ways. And with this, I'll conclude by the second half of the paragraph that I read of Belinder's. She continues, does this afterlife have a point of origin? We talked about originary points of cultural studies. Does this afterlife have a point of origin, or does it need a point of origin? Is it located in that moment when an idea first takes hold, the first movement or the last of the body in the creative act? Is the artist a participant in this afterlife? Is the process its own critique? She asks. Thank you.
Sadly, we have no time for dialogue with the audience because of the time constraint of the habitat. So the next panel.
Thank you, Geeta, Sheikh Bhai and Ashish. The last panel of this evening focuses on the theatre-making experiments at the Kasauli Art Centre. Our theatre director and pedagogue Anuradha Kapoor will share the discussion with artist Nilima Sheikh, author Gitanjali Shri, and filmmaker and curator Madhusri Datta. Unfortunately, Neelam Mansingh Chaudhary, who was also supposed to be a part of the panel, fell ill, so she isn't here with us today. So could I invite all of you, please?
Thank you very much for actually giving us an opportunity to think back on many of the processes that happened at Kasauli, many of the processes that were actually put in motion by the space, the site, the atmosphere, but I'll talk about that in a moment. I'm going to try and talk about the various registers that happened in terms of speech and talk and writing, both of the book and of the texts there. And I'm going to try and talk about also the way things were redistributed, or not but distributed among ourselves as theatre makers in unusual and unexpected ways. And I'm going to talk about the fact that for us in '89, there was this wonderful, difficult, perplexing thing happening where the seminar was up in the dining room all day and the rehearsals were in the pit, and there was a way, or at least an attempt, to bring it together and to fail, to be angry, to sometimes succeed, but it was a kind of rolling process which the seminar that Kumkum had curated put us through a kind of rigor in the making of the plays that came up that time. It was a devised text by Gitanjali called Naika Bhed, and then there was another text that was built with an idea of how to look at Ghare Baire by Tagore. The search came in the text of Ghare Baire, we thought, because of certain things, I'll come to that. And then I'll come to what I think is critical to the theatre making process, certainly, but to the art making process in Kasauli, and that's atmosphere, which is, again, another perplexing category. And then, lastly, to the idea that in Kasauli, I think, as theatre makers, as artists, we were making and thinking, or making as thinking. And it was something that I don't think we knew at that time. But we certainly, I think, for me, it has become a process by which devising in the theatre or collaboration in the theatre has taken on a certain form. But let me begin by saying that in Belinder's text, we have all of what we normally think usually in texts in the theatre. There is internal monologue, there's aside, there's a soliloquy, there's a conversation, there's a dialogue, there's an exchange, and every time the form shifts. So in some senses, Belinder's book catches so much of what we were trying to do, and as part of the aside, the soliloquy, the monologue, it was something that I think, if I remember clearly, and Gitanjali was working on that in a different register at a different time, but in a different text. But this multiplicity of voices has become, I think, something that has been able to be part of a grammar. And I think that grammar was set in Kasauli by actually certain distribution of responsibilities. And these are not particular to the writer, the filmmaker, the painter, the actor. It's not always the actor who will articulate the word. It is not always the writer whose word will be articulated. It's a way of simultaneously starting on projects together. So Vidya Rao's music will tell us something about the text. Gitanjali's text will tell us something about delivery. Nilima's idea of design will tell us something about the mountains. It all gets together. And this actually has become, I think, I could say for most of us, a grammar of working. Kumkum says in the book, quoting what she had initially thought when she had put together the seminar, something that's quite important: open up materials in their historical contexts, reworking them and engaging with them with their contemporary potentials, also recognizing certain activist energies in the making, which would be street theatre grammars, writing a pamphlet, doing a report. So all this at the moment is coming through in the way that she curates the seminar and in the way that it percolates down into the pit where we are rehearsing. I want to bring then this, I said, redistribution. I want to quickly point to two things. This kind of responsibility of looking at things together, and I then quote another word from which is now used a lot in devising Donna Haraway's response ability, the ability to respond. I think that becomes critical because it's an ability to respond to space, the ability to respond to various kinds of making, and the ability to respond to each other's starting points, middle points, and usually there's no end point. So here I would like to bring something which I think is critical to Kasauli itself and the way that Vivan actually conceptualized, and I think it's very correct what Ghulam said, that it's an artwork in itself, it's a project, and that is atmosphere. And atmosphere is a key thing, I think, in the memories of all of us who did theatre there, because atmosphere, as theoretically often described, both material and immaterial. You can breathe it in, you can talk about it, but how do you make it? So in some senses, the hills were writing the text. As in ancient Greek theatre, the hills and the amphitheatre write the text. In that sense, the trees, the night, they were actually coming into text, the playmaking. And the next step is the most difficult step, that after you've made the play, then what do you do when you bring it down into the planes? So how do you rematerialize? And I think it's, in some senses, been part of the project, at least I would say, in the theatre for myself and for many people, and I think I can speak for Gitanjali there, rematerializing what happens in the hills, rematerializing that in a theatre in Sri-Ram Centre. How do you do it? And I mean, there is, just for the moment, I'll just give one example. When we did Gora there, Vivan dealt with the valley and the scale of the mountain. When we came back here to do the show in Sri-Ram Centre, he totally changed it by bringing the hull of a ship. And there was some confusion about it, but suddenly you realize that rematerialization is not an illustration, it's not a copying. You find a way of what the atmosphere was doing. And that, I think, becomes quite important. It crept into the work that we did, how atmosphere becomes really one of the ways of dealing with theatre making. And lastly, this idea of making as thinking. You make and you think together, and you do not separate the two, because there's no way of standing outside the material, which is both atmosphere, text, song, whatever. You don't stand outside and pull out a meaning, a pre-existing meaning, but putting them together actually might create an assembly of meanings, and which becomes very important, especially when you're working with a place that has such a distinct atmospheric position or atmospheric context. And lastly, I think it is traveling alongside, traveling not necessarily towards a particular destination. Yes, there's a destination when you have a play, which is a production, but traveling alongside with your various disciplines actually opens a dialogue, which becomes, for many of us, I think, what has kept a long friendship, a long dialogue, as well as probably a grammar. I can say that this kind of grammar, which meeting together, putting a picture together, putting an image together, also comes into the book in the way that the images configure to give you a series of intercuts, interloops running alongside. May I ask Gitanjali, then Nilu, and then I won't ask a question if you will come in, or if you want to sit in there. And yeah. Thank you, George.
Hello, everyone. I was not very sure how this panel was going to be conducted, so I'm afraid I am a little lost. I should have written down my piece, but to go back to one of the dialogues I had written once for a play in Kasauli, जो कर्रे जवाब बर वक्त नहीं सूझे अब सूझ रहे हैं. So it's always going to be at the wrong time. At the moment, I have what I have, and I'm going to meander a bit, and I'll speak with you. Just a lot of recall there. Kasauli was an amazing time. It was an amazing beginning. I'm going to talk personal, but I know that what I'm saying is something shared by a lot of us. We were all so young to begin with. We were really so young. We had a lot of us had just started our career in whatever we were doing, and अपने पे उतना भरोसा ना रहा हो, ज़माने पे बहुत भरोसा था उस समय. तो बहुत उत्साह के साथ we were doing whatever we were doing. And I've used the word serendipity in the little piece I've written in the book. And I think for me, it really was serendipitous, my landing up in Kasauli. And I went as a fiction writer. I had just begun publishing my fiction. And the next thing I knew was that I was writing scripts for plays that all of us were doing. And I'm going to tell you how wonderful it was and how terrible. I'll tell you that also. But to begin with, let me speak of the word which I think we often repeat amongst ourselves, that it was all to do with collaboration. The workshops, the different peoples who came together to get the play ready. It was all collaboration. And for me, it really was such a learning process. I think it was a very important moment in my career. So many things which must have been latent in me got strengthened, and many things I think got initiated. So collaboration taught me the the coming together, not just of people, but the coming together of different genres. I think we've all talked a lot about that. But really, जो अलग-अलग विधाओं की गुत्थम गुत्था थी, वो कितनी खूबसूरती से और कितनी inspiring तरह से हमको आगे ले जाता था. I mean, it was something quite new for me, and it was a discovery in a way. I mean, it's something very obvious, but I think I needed a Kasauli to realize that, you know, every art form really has within it every art form. And that I learnt for my writing, which I was doing, for my fiction writing, which I was doing so much in solitude and alone. And I learnt with the people I was collaborating with in Kasauli. The whole process, I mean, I think Anu said a little about it, but the whole process was so amazing because, the first time I made this great mistake of writing what I thought was a play and handing it to them, and they did 1 or 2 scenes from that and then came back to me and said, now from here you write on again. So I realized after that that I must never do that they're not doing my play. There's something we are making together. So I would really do it in bits and pieces. I would do something, give it to them. If it worked, we would talk about it. They'd give something back to me. I would give something more to them. And we would proceed almost brick by brick and get the imarat ready. So this whole thing, I mean, getting in people like Neelu and Vidya and I think Dadi and Mrs. Rao. I mean, people, sort of somebody from dance, somebody from painting, somebody from music. The way they were bringing in their inputs into it was really showing me how multiple narratives get created. I'm not the only one responsible for the narrative. There are narratives which are crossing over from one to the other. There are narratives which are actually going parallel. There are narratives which are going in opposite directions, and they're all coming together in this something that we are, the end product. So collaboration was really, if I may use certain rhetorical sort of terms, then it really was all about plurality, all about polyvalence, all about polyphony. And I think I'll say a little more about that at some point, but I think it was a very learning experience for me. Sheikh used the word takeaway. I'll tell you one takeaway there was for me, and that was humility. But so much humility, and that's where I'm complaining. So much humility, because I worked so hard, and very quickly I realized that I didn't even know where I figured in this, whatever was being made. I didn't know who had written it. I mean, really, is that my play? And I happen to have a face which looks very anxious. So the actors assumed that I was getting very bothered because I was giving them the words and they were doing other things with it. Or Anu would make me write these, reams and reams of pages and then cut them all out. So they thought that's what was getting me anxious. But actually, I was just amazed. And I was just amazed at the fluidity and ephemerality of everything. That I give them something, I have thought of it in a certain way and I've given it to them. And then they give it back to me and to everyone. And some of the words I recognized, but they're not the way I had rendered them. Just a different placement or a different tone and even different renderings every day. So for me, it really was a humbling experience, I'm nowhere there. So, but it made me so humble and it made me lose my identity so thoroughly and destroyed my ego so thoroughly that to date, I do not have the courage to say that I am in any way a theatre person. And this, in a world where I know people who, they make one painting and in their CV it comes in, you know, they're a painter. As it happens, I mean, I have done several plays with all of them, but I haven't to date been able to say that I am a theatre person. So, well, thank you for that humility. Yeah. But I think this collaboration, I think one of the best things that happened, you know, in this collaboration was, and again I'm going to use certain terms which might sound rhetorical, you know, it's narebazi, but it's not narebazi. But you know, the coming together of people from different genres, of course, but also, you know, different genders, different regions, different classes, and coming together in an atmosphere of mutual, you know, respect and encouragement. That, again, was an absolutely wonderful thing, and I just spoke of having lost my identity, but I think what it was doing in this collaboration process was that identity was not a divisive thing here. It was something, it was actually making people much more relaxed about their identities, making so much give and take possible. And, you know, a boy from rural Bihar could feel very good about his input of giving that Londa dance. And, you know, I mean, everybody could come with their own flavors and their own experiences and actually enrich everybody else. And it was, I think it was, it's a micro experience, can you say, of something which can be such a macro solution, you know, the sort of just bringing different people together and how it just makes for so much more love and camaraderie between them and so much more respect, and identity is not a problem. So I think the gender thing also, I mean, I'm not going to talk about feminism, but I think I dare say that the kind of group we all made, macho culture could not have, you know, flourished out there, and if there was anything of that sort, it would just have to fall away. With so many women around doing very proactive and doing things, I think men quite spontaneous, I'm just one point, but I think men quite spontaneously were learning to relook at their, you know, sort of male identity, and I think we do have many of them who have actually had a very different relationship with their bodies thereafter. So I think that was a great takeaway, a great learning experience. For me, I would say, you know, it came at such a formative phase of my writing journey that it gave me many directions and really freed me. You know, I learned, like I said, I learned, you know, that well, words. I was dealing with words. That's one thing I often talk about. You know, as a fiction writer, I was dealing primarily in words, but you know, I might have come in to the scene with some stereotypical ideas about what words mean. Words are carriers of certain literal meanings. I'm just simplifying it. And I think Kasauli very quickly showed me that words, that meaning is not conveyed by one single thing. And words are not just the repository of literal meanings, and that words can also be completely redundant in whatever you're trying to express, which again was a very humbling lesson, you know, for somebody who was writing words and words and words, only to have them, you know, completely removed. But what it did to me, I think, was I learned the redundancy of words, but I also reclaimed words in a new way in this process of learning. Words began to mean something more than just simple repositories of meaning. They actually began to be entities in their own right. I think I learned to respect words because of this experience in this collaborative theatre experience. And I learned to recognize, words in their as separate, independent entities and in their majesty. And I think all that influenced my fiction writing as well. Orality is the other thing, I think, which really was a great lesson in my Kasauli education. Of course, I come from a culture where orality continues to play a big role, but here I was, living with people who did things with that orality, and I learned to listen to art. I learned to see art in a different way. So I think that's one thing this experience really did to a lot of us, was to teach us how to look at art, how to look at different art, how to actually start using all our senses, the mind of course, but also all our other senses. और मैं क्या बोलूँ पता नहीं, पर अगर कुछ बातें आएंगी तो कहूँगी, पर मुझे लगता है कि ख़ास तौर से यही था कि Kasauli and collaboration and all of us, I think, emerged much the richer with Vivan and Geeta. In this case, in the theatre thing, as being behind the scenes, but providing the entire support system. तो बस यही कहते हैं, Kasauli क्या बात थी, वाह.
What I'm going to say is perhaps a repetition of a lot of things that Gitanjali has perhaps said or implied, because some things, in some ways, the act of the writer and the act of a painter are amongst the most lonely in the world of arts. We sit in our studios and we do little paintings or big paintings, and occasionally get a chance to show them to the rest of the world. One is, I think that, I'm not speaking for all artists, but for myself, this activity perhaps ladened me with a sense of self-indulgence and perhaps of guilt. I'm speaking a little incorrectly, a little politically incorrectly, because I shouldn't be downing my own profession in this manner. But so when Anuradha asked me if I would be willing to be part of a collective which had some searches in feminist terms of creating theatre together, I was both a little scared, but actually immensely gratified. That Vivan made this possible, and that then he stepped back and let Anu conceive it in entirely her own ways, and not just Anu, but all of us getting together and conceiving something, speaks all about Kasauli, all about Vivan. And it's the other thing that, before I get into what working in this theatre workshop did for me, I should mention the other workshops that I have attended in Kasauli. They were very special, and I'm full of lot of wonderful memories and for them. But in some sense, the primary thing that perhaps I received from those workshops was now what Anu has made clearer for me, was the notion of atmosphere. I think that for a painter, that's again a great, it's a common term. We use it. We understand atmosphere. But again, there was, I think, at a certain time, again, a guilt about it, that you don't submit your work to an excessive submission to what is perceived as atmosphere in the visual arts. I think that what Kasauli did for me was not just, I mean, I know that as a painter, I know that, say, for instance, if I'm in the hills, and I do have a place in the hills I often go to, I start a painting there. The light and air and everything over there is such that I cannot bring that painting back to the plains and do it. So, so for me to understand that in theatre there's a recognition of that is very, very gratifying, and I think I'm putting together retrospectively my thoughts about the earlier workshops, and that I think that an understanding of what atmosphere means in a work of art, even if it is figurative, it is abstract, it is whatever, it is something that is integral and very important to me. Now, I think I should now get on to talking about what the theatre workshop did for me. We've all talked about the collaborative aspect. Gitanjali spoke about it very well. I think the first thing it did for me was to free myself the responsibility of creating alone. And I think that's wonderful for a painter, that whatever you do is not about you. It is about what other people are going to do with it. And it's never ending. It goes round and round. It is like if I create a mise-en-scene and then there is an actor acting in front of it, it is his body or her body that makes that whatever visuality I've created come alive. It doesn't have a meaning without that. And that's sort of, in a way, such a reassuring thought in a way, you know, that you're in this together, you're responsible together, and that you are creating something that you don't have to bother about it being yours, authentic, original, or anything, because it is all about all of you, and there are no eyes here. So that, I think, was, and in a way, I should say that has fed into my work, in my own later work. There has been this great interest in working with other people's hands and eyes and minds. Whether it is, I use sometimes in my work the Sanji stencils of a master craftsman from Mathura. It is a one-sided collaboration somewhat, I do know, but it gives me the opportunity to use somebody else's worldview in my work. And that's, I can tell you, that's very gratifying. I've also worked with craftsmen from Kashmir in making a very large mural. I would not have been able to do it had I not previously had this experience of working on a collaborative. How not to tell people what to do. I mean, it is the thought of that you're sitting together and the work emerges together that you talk, you show, you share images, you do things together, and then something comes up and there is something created, then an adjunct is created, and then maybe a contradiction is created. But there is a whole process of that kind of making that it all started perhaps in Kasauli in the making of Naika Bhed. There is another thing that I should talk about my fears, is that when Anuradha asked me that to do this, I said, how will I go and create all those big things that I want to paint? So there was also the need to have somebody with me who was more hands-on, and I'm thinking of people that I know sitting over here who have helped me create the things that I visualize, I've painted, but make them into what they are. So I've just only painted them. They're made by many of us. So I think there's another way that this theatre workshop brought meaning into my life. Again, I was sitting in Baroda. I was working, thinking of certain ways in which I could investigate the feminist. And I think it happened almost accidentally by my trying to reclaim my life as distinct from the life of other people around me, and painting my children or my neighborhood or my family or my home became a way of my being able to do that, and that was not acceptable to many people, but it opened up for me many a way of going forward. But then I was feeling alone. It was a time when there was a lot of feminist activism in metropolitan cities, but not in Baroda. And I was feeling quite alone. And again, when I was asked to be in a workshop with activists, feminists, it was for me such a learning experience, and it also taught me, I'd say that straight away, to move from the victim image of the Champa series I created of a dowry burning incident into looking at the writings of poetry of women who could be role models, who could be inspirational. And that too, I think, sitting and talking, not only in Kasauli, but also in the workshop that we had before Kasauli, opened a new area of feminism for me. Susie Tharil's book, Women Writing in India, came out around that time, and that, as everybody knows, became many of our sitting on our desks all the time as our Bibles. So these are the ways in which Kasauli has done what it did. And there's one other big way, is that working in an open space like that and creating things for an open space gave you an understanding of scale that perhaps was unlimited, and that always remains an unfulfilled inspiration to be able to create something for Kasauli. Thanks.
All of you would agree that I'm in an extremely difficult position because I'm the last one, and thankfully a least amount of time I have, that I'm quite happy with, because actually I'm quite a minor speaker here, because, not because I consider myself minor, but I was a very minor participant in Kasauli. I went there only once, and I was sort of an intern. I was just fresh out of college, and the main person behind that workshop 1989 that we are talking about was centered around Anuradha, who was my teacher only a couple of years back. So I was carrying that baggage on my shoulders, so that's why my reminiscence will be completely different. It was almost like coming of age. And in a way, if I mark it, Kasauli was definitely my coming of age in many other ways than getting out of the shadow of your teacher. And so, since I'm put here, I was listening to everybody, and I was thinking that at which point it connects to my life or my practice, which actually started just a couple of years after that. My career was yet to start. I mean, I didn't even know what I wanted to do, and actually never did theatre as a professional. So maybe Kasauli workshop was one event which convinced me that theatre is not my thing, though I studied it. And that's also important, that sometimes disorientation, you need occasions to disorient yourself to something else. Ashish talked about afterlife. He used the word afterlife a few times, and I was thinking, so what are the afterlives? If I am to write about the afterlife of Kasauli, not because I participated in one event, but I know about it, I read about it, I heard people talking about it throughout my youth, and always wondered that one could ever reach that level of discursive engagement ever. And just sitting here, I thought of talking about something else, but now I changed my mind, and I want to talk about this, that it's very interesting. So I have not read the book. Belinder, I told you that I just saw the book yesterday as I arrived in Delhi. So I have not read the book, but I just checked the dates. So it is 79 to 1991 is very interesting time. 76. So it is emergency to just pre-Babri Masjid. That one should say emergency to Advani. Okay, emergency to Rath Yatra. And this emergency period, as you know, I mean, not my youth, but many other people's, that it was the time of study circle, intense discussion, but all underground, hush-hush, and it was the time to write one leaflet over 7 intense nights of discussion. So in that period, Kasauli Art Centre was envisaged, was conceptualized mainly by Vivan, but it cannot be done alone. Obviously, many other people are there, mainly Gita. And it was to bring broadly, it was a nation-making agenda. Nation-making agenda as in the context of emergency. It's not the post-independence nation-making agenda. It is that agenda is attacked, is collapsing, and so what is the next agenda? And it needs intense discussion, and discussion should be around practices, because Vivan Sundaram is a practitioner. So it was around practices, but it was to develop newer practice of discourse in that context. And very interesting is ending in 1991, but these are, after all, Kasauli is on top of somewhere. I mean, I remember when this play happened, and standing there when only we were the audience, and some 10 vague people, tourists, dropped by, and I told Anu that, and Anu was very disgusted with my very extremely realistic questions. So who sees it? Because we were discussing. I mean, I was too young to understand that. I mean, I'm not being blasphemous here. Actually, I'm saying sorry I said that. But it was also the time, 1991, we had to also start thinking so, because public discourse was changing. Public culture was changing. Rath Yatra was the public spectacle. It was becoming the national spectacle. So we had to come to the street also and not compromising the discourses. So to bring the discourses to the street, and as you were saying that coming from the Kasauli Hills to the Serum Centre is part of that, but then beyond Serum Centre also, which Vivan Sundaram did very as eloquently as he did at Kasauli Art Centre. He did various public art projects, mainly with Sahmat, but with other institutions in his own work, in his own installation. 90s onwards, we can see that a deep commitment to public art. So afterlife of Kasauli Art Centre, I would say, is also my practice, my life, which 1991 exactly we started, 1990 in fact, we started Majlis in Bombay with actually a feminist art festival, feminist theatre festival, where all of them were there, almost to bless the occasion, and we started it. And the seed of it is definitely in Kasauli. So it was that question that I mean, there are two things here, and I want to make it very clear. One is that we were making also in Kasauli Art Centre an audience of ourselves. We were also teaching ourselves to see, to hear. We are making in 1 hour, and the next hour we are audience for some other work, and then the next hour we are again making. So there is a circular motion between reception and production, which is very important, and it can happen only when you live together. Otherwise, workspace is different, so you enter somebody else's workspace, you are a receiver. So that is very clear. I mean, it's in our bodies, we cannot unlearn that. So it has to be a neutral space of living in an equal space. So we were becoming an audience, and then when we were coming down the hills, we are bringing the experience of producing together or making and thinking together, but also making an audience of ourselves. We are not only practitioners, which in another language Nilima just now spoke about. And these experiences then came to the next phase of public art, political art as public art, which actually brought many of my generation. I can see Sharmila here. So after Majlis, Open Circle came up, we together did many public art, political art projects, which Vivan was always very interested, World Social Forum. I would put this as a legacy. I will put Kasauli Art Centre a legacy up to our collaborative work in World Social Forum, where again, Vivan was refusing to be an iconic artist. He came and did an installation like any young person, where 150,000 people attended, and I will share a joke with you at the end of it. I think everybody expects me to say some joke. That Vivan's great Indian bazaar installation we put in a very prime space in World Social Forum. Now, World Social Forum, many of you may have attended it. Main space means it's a sea of humanity of all kinds, and people are like, it was an utopia. It was the last of the mega romance of our life. So people came with their agenda, and they were very charged, and they walked over the Great Indian Bazaar. The sea of humanity. On the first day, within the few hours, they walked over it. Vivan was there. I was also there. Maybe Sharmila was also there. So I said, so Vivan, okay. Thank you.
We're right on time to finish this conversation, and I don't think we have any time to be able to talk about it together, but I think that I might end by saying that in some senses this idea that making, thinking, articulating, and as everybody said, looking at work and then looking while making it, thinking of something else, that's a circulation and that's a distribution that actually the experience of Kasauli has given us, and it in some senses also is about actually being able to look at each other's work as being possible to work through, to bring in, to reorganize without what all friends have said here, without any particular sense of this is mine, that is not mine. So this is in memory of what happened there, and in a way the afterlife is often the grammar, certainly for most of us in the theatre, of learning the grammar of devising and of collaboration, which actually is pre-script, not necessarily. It's the place where the scripts and performance scripts develop. It's the place where we learn how to re-speak certain lines, certain words, as Gitanjali was saying, and certain kinds of dialogues that have appeared at that time have I think, changed. Writing of theatre writing in Hindi, at least, in dialogue writing in Hindi, in very substantial ways, and that's because there is a very close relationship between what is written and what is spoken and how it gets changed. So here is to a huge collaborative project that actually brings in so many energies and allows them all to function in not necessarily harmony, but in kind of disruptive energies as well. And there I want to just end by saying that the name of the group that we all have worked in is called Vivadi, and it was suggested as a name in Kasauli by Vidya Rao, because Vivadi is the swar that doesn't harmonize, and Vivad is discussion. So in some senses, our conceptualization of a certain kind of theatre happened because of all these disharmony, as well as the argument, as well as the talking, as well as debate. So thank you very much.
Thank you, all of you, and also all our other speakers, and to all of you really. We were worried about the traffic closures and things, but you've all come here today, and thank you for that. The books you can still see outside when you're going out. If you'd like to get information about things that we're doing, please leave your names and your contact details. One of the, or more than one of the afterlives of the Kasauli Art Centre as it existed is, of course, SSAF that you've heard about today. So we hope that in some way we'll be able to share that with you. But also we're hoping to have an exhibition about the Kasauli Art Centre at the Punjab University Museum later in October. It's going to have Gitanjali scripts, correspondences, original documents, and other archival material, along with, of course, the original artwork. So we will share that information once we have dates. Thank you all so much.